Hello, I'm Dr. Rick Chambers, and I'm here with Gail Huxley for This is Book Sense. And we're continuing with the Instagram review, and I'll start with this one since it's a quote by Carl Jung. Insight that dawns slowly seems to me to have more lasting effects than a fitful idealism, which is unlikely to hold out for long. Carl Jung, The Undiscovered Self. Wondering where idealism, like kind of this difference between idealism and an insight that dawns slowly. We usually think of insight being like sudden and quick. Maybe there's another kind of insight.
So this one, I actually chose it because it's the only thing that could comfort me at the time. Because there is a sense, I think, too, if you feel like you're very lost and you don't know where you're going in life, you haven't really become the person you want to become, for no matter what age it seems, we feel like we're so far behind. I often feel like I am so far behind and I'm thinking, why is it taking me so long? What's wrong with me? And then the only thing that comforted me was this, is because, all right, maybe all of this time is necessary for whatever I'm learning to really be instilled within me so I can keep it with me.
Yes. So when you say comfort, it sounds like you mean more so that you want like kind of both a need for hope and for not giving up.
Yeah, sustain, to help me sustain or continue. But it is, I don't want to say like pacifying. Comfort is, I mean, it seems like to swaddle. So I wrote something at the bottom of it.
Yes.
That was a hope for other people. But really, I was writing something, and this is what I often do when I'm writing something like this that seems directed at other people, is just directed at me. And something that I found, or that I wish, or that I've written for myself. And I've noticed that people seem to respond more to something that comes from a deep place of suffering and desperation that I've written to try to bring myself out of it.
And there we could compare like something real versus something like idealistic. Like idealistic thoughts don't seem to last very long and don't seem to have very deep roots. Like they're more viral, they're more like kind of come and go or surface than perhaps things. Carl Jung also, I don't know if it was him, it was somebody said, all great things mature slowly. And in this world of internet and of now and of like youth, it's nice to be reminded that some things unfold very slowly and that our actual lives unfold very slowly.
Yeah, I mean, we returned to the topic of youth and aging. I mean, we have talked about in the last 2 videos that we've done. And that's why I didn't really want to bring it up, but it's kind of there. That's why, is because, you know, the internet is, I have to pull away from social media sometime soon, because I'm so tired of seeing, you know, this idea that like, if you haven't made it, if you haven't become who you are, like it's just over for you. When the reality of it is that people sort of come, you know, what is it? Their insight dawns on people at all. We're all in like completely different stories. We might share some things, but somehow my mind and maybe the mind of others returns to this one story over and over again, that we're supposed to reach these markers by a certain time. We have to remind ourselves over and over that we're on completely different timelines and storylines.
Yes.
And 2, I think that this one, you know, it works on an individual level and on a cultural level. And
how's the cultural
level is because we're coming to terms with now. So I mean, we need a change in culture and the world. And we're seeing this, especially, you know, last year, kind of bubbling at the surface, and we can't hold on anymore. And so, and we're wondering, all right, so we need change, but how are we going to wait on people to change? So maybe what's happening is this isn't a fitful idealism that's happening.
Oh,
This idea of change, it's that this insight that has, you know, it's dawning slowly. It's, you know, it's been happening for years and years and years and years, but now it's dawning on us.
Carl Jung's also known for taking the really long, or seeming to have a really long view. And he said, like, humanity's still in its adolescence. And so what if, like what we've been experiencing recently, there's this sense of like pressure and of things like getting tighter and tighter. A quote like this seems to create some breathing space, or just some relief from that tightness, both individually and culturally. And suggests like something biological, an insight that like grows at the pace of like biology, or that there's something natural to the process. Mm-hmm. So have patience.
Yeah, natural that can feel supernatural in a way, because it's something that, especially insight, I think it's often forming at the subconscious level, unconscious, I don't know.
Excellent.
Use.
Yes.
And then, so when it dawns, or when, you know, I think insight happens in like different little, like, I don't know what the word is, kind of appears in little bubbles. That's the image that's coming to my mind right now. Anytime that I've had this little hint of insight, it feels like I've been trying to remember something, or I've been working on something, and finally I've got it, or I've solved it, just that one little bit. It never feels like nothing came before it. It just came out of thin air.
Yes. I also like that you had this phrase, like, that you don't feel time has been lost or wasted. That I think that's a very important feeling. And the big fear is of like wasting or losing any of our experience in life. And that would be a good fear to kind of like put away, to not be tortured by.
Yeah. And as I said, this came from a place of this self-torture. I was like, when I wrote this, yeah, January 1st, I was up that night and like almost pain.
January 1st. I didn't realize that.
Yeah. That I was, because I feel like I've wasted it's this horrible idea that, you know, your 20s are supposed to be the most productive, hustling, whatever. And I feel like I've wasted it with just inner growth and no physical work. And I was feeling a lot of pain from that. I was like, I didn't have the external experiences. All of the work and experience has mostly been here the past 4 years. And I was torturing myself over, why did I do that? And gosh, this has to be for some reason that will help me later down the road. Right. Please.
We can make a mistake leaning one way or the other. And it's kind of, there's the possibility of a mistake, of being too complacent and of not having enough of a sense of urgency. But often I think we're more tortured by this sense of wasting or losing or not taking advantage of time, when that may not be the problem. That this suggests, and even this conversation, or a conversation that kind of unfolds slowly versus one that seems to like, you know, be fast paced, hit the mark, say what you have to say and move on. That seems to be what the world values. But conversations can take time to develop.
Yeah, and so because we've been kind of trained, that's not quite the word, that I'm conditioned to, invest ourselves in or look at conversations, look at content, whatever that's easy to consume, maybe easy to digest. You have to kind of retrain your mind to look at a conversation or have a conversation that unfolds slowly and see it as, and not write it off, because often it's written off as, get to the point already. You're just droning on and on, when really this 20-minute video could have been 2 minutes. Sometimes that's the case. Sometimes it's just indulgence.
But sometimes there's something, again, that's organic, that kind of comes at its own pace, that we can't manage or control. Or what about this idea of forcing things?
Yeah, so I think that's a part of the quote too, is that, so fitful idealism, it's often forced. I think fitful, maybe suggests that as well. And you get crushed under it, where you get crushed when you try to force it. After a while, can feel good for a short amount of time.
Yes. This is certainly not the only time Carl Jung mentioned idealism, and he didn't have a really high opinion of it. And saw it as, and for humanity in general, I remember he kind of said, like, idealism is not going to, like, help. Now, he wasn't saying there's no hope. He was just saying, like, don't put your hopes in something that's too idealistic. Or grounded hope. Like, he was very grounded.
Sometimes what we're told is idealistic, or when we're being too idealistic, is that just a way of preventing us from hoping or thinking that there can be a better world?
I would say idealism denies the shadow. And so idealism, like, kind of wouldn't realize how complex or difficult something might be. Idealism doesn't have any nuance, for sure.
Also, to kind of backtrack to talking about a conversation unfolding, sometimes I think that I don't know, I need to stop saying you. I use it when I mean I, but I keep doing, so I don't seem like I'm just talking about myself. But sometimes I have to see the same thing over and over and over in many different forms for it to really hit me. So sometimes I think I say the same thing in many different ways or you have to say the same thing in many different ways for me to process it and understand it.
I remember from my education background, it said that a child has to see a sight word 70 times. They have to have 70 exposures to something to be able to recognize it. And I think a lot of life is that way, especially the important things. And it brings up the image that you put with this is like, it looks like a spiral. And often, that's often used for the life journey of you're coming around. So written on January 1st, you're coming around the spiral again, and there's a similar thing, but you're at a different place in the spiral. We do return. I'm a therapist, and so a lot of people always begin with, well, it's nothing's really changed. And yet, as we get to talking about things, very often something has changed. And it just takes time to for all the changes to accumulate.
So that picture is one I've distorted of myself. It's the second picture.
Oh.
That I've because
gotcha.
Yeah, I was looking at, as I was having this crisis. I was looking and thinking, is there any of that person remaining within me?
And yet it looks like at that time you were following a very different dream.
Yeah, one that was partially my own and partially not. But
oh, we could do a whole episode on that. How long does it take for us to differentiate like what is ours and what was like kind of from the outside, maybe with the best of intentions? That is a process that takes perhaps a lifetime.
Teenagers
that can't really be done quickly.
Yeah, although teenagers I think are pretty good at being able to tell what's being put on them or forced on them. And this was a rebellious phase, that picture.
And yet, like working with people in their 30s and 40s, it's very like kind of what they thought was not them turns out to be them, what they were rebelling against, or it's not all resolved by the teenage years of what is like truly theirs and what's being imposed.
Oh yeah. Oh no, nothing has been resolved for me. But oh, what was it? Okay, so you said that what was it, that a child has to see the same word like 70
yes.
times, whatever. This kind of relates to another post where I was talking about reading and that I just kind of fly through books and I don't reread them. Sometimes yes. I don't have my time.
Oh, excellent.
Because so I'm so worried about time passing, life passing, needing to get all of this information as much as I can, that I don't really sometimes like chew on whatever I've just read or go back and really allow whatever insight is within it yes. to slowly dawn on me.
Right. Especially with books, what if what we're chewing on is not a conscious thought?
No.
That there are things that just stick with you and that circle around books you never put down.
Yeah, and I often have a vague sense that something I've read or something that's been presented to me is kind of churning subconsciously and I just let it do its thing.
So it's almost a faith kind of feeling, kind of, and dealing with this like fear of regrets. I would say in our personal experience, nothing is ever lost. And especially for an artist, no experience is ever wasted or lost. It will be used at some point in your art. But it's this idea, there's something growing within you. The insight is growing within you, with or without your like conscious work sometimes. And it's an organic process.
Yeah, but so I think part of my desperation lately is I've recognized that I have this like subconscious process going on, and I think I'm getting closer to a new phase, and I recognize that, and so I'm like, all right, finish up. I'm desperate for the new phase.
Yes, right.
And I'm being like a kid saying, come on, can we go? Are we almost there?
Right. That sense of being close to a new phase for both individuals and perhaps for a culture is not a pleasant experience. In fact, it feels like this pressure that we were mentioning. And there is this sense of urgency to things.
Hmm. It feels like being close to death. When you feel like you're close to death, then it's a good place, or it's ripe for fitful idealism or fitful nihilism, existentialism.
Well, yeah, like kind of close to death is kind of the opposite of like fitful idealism. So I would say that's closer to like a dawning insight, with the idea that in both Christianity, nature, also it's a Buddhist concept, life, death, life process, that death often like kind of New Year's brings up this image of kind of out with the old and in with the new, feels like dying first. Very often our periods of growth are preceded by a sense of coming to an end or sense of death.
And it's a time when nostalgia starts to really, I think, return. You start looking at everything in the past with this already the sense of loss and preciousness.
Yes, and isn't it wonderful to look backwards with nostalgia instead of just regret? Like that kind of regret would kill the past.
It's all intertwined for me, nostalgia and regret.
I would tweak it just a little. It's like there's loss in nostalgia. What about having loss without regret? Or loss not necessarily being regret?
I feel like it would take a long time to get to a point where you can do that.
And maybe this is the connection with idealism. I think people have been shaped now, or what was the word you used? Kind of where we've been influenced to kind of believe we could live a life without loss. So if there is loss, then we must have made a mistake or be doing something wrong. And that may be an idealistic like illusion.
Well, I think too that we're, again, conditioned, I can hear him going at his paw. We're kind of conditioned to feel as though we have to do everything that we want to do, everything that we need to accomplish before loss occurs of any sort. And loss occurs throughout life.
Oh, yes. Possible. Right. Before loss occurs, or this fear that even if you accomplish something, then there's a period of loss.
Well, something that was really hard for me to accept is I realized that I was partially not working towards whatever because I never wanted to reach the peak. I always wanted to be going towards the peak, but because after the peak is loss. But then, and this is something else in the most recent post that I made, or not the most recent, which was it? I don't know. I'll find it and put it in, whatever. That life can get away from you if you're always just trying to climb up towards the peak. You can spend a lifetime climbing and then life is over until life is over.
Yes. I often refer to Carl Jung or Joseph Campbell, and I often send you a lot of messages from Michael Meade or kind of some of his posts on Instagram with the idea that the journeys begin with a descent. His latest podcast is kind of talking about a descent. The modern tale is life is this like advance upward and one directional, like, whereas more traditional mythologies, descent is part of the journey. Not a failure, but it's kind of often the beginning of the journey.
And so the hero's, what was it? The hero's journey?
Yes.
It's getting more popular in culture. I haven't watched the video. I wonder if you had, where stories of old, it's titled "Your Life Is Not a Hero's Journey."
Oh, I've watched it, and so this amazing thing, yes, like, and I've taken to saying the archetypal eye is opening. Used to only a specialist would know about Joseph Campbell, very few, or the hero's journey, and now it is almost common knowledge. And yet, There, and YouTube is creating this like revolution where it comes up very often. And now not only is it coming up, like kind of the YouTube video begins to question even the what was called the monomyth, the myth of the hero. So now there's some like critique or questioning or ability to see even that story can be destructive and misleading at times.
Another insight maybe that had to dawn slowly in culture and an individual scale.
Oh, wow. Yes. I think that has everything to do with it. Of the world may have, how many millions have died with people following their cultural stories in an unquestioning way, like wonderful, heroic people. And is that part of like our cultural, especially of nationalism, of nationalist stories, that it's kind of your duty to do that? And it may be like kind of, it may be, but it's also, should that be an unquestioned narrative?
Well, ideally, should question everything. But first, you even have to have the tools to question. I don't think sometimes questioning comes naturally, but sometimes you need the education first.
Our culture, like we are, in some ways it's terrifying and in some ways it's hopeful. You know, the kind of the image of the fool on the edge of the precipice, that there's this sense that we're losing our stories and that there's not a coherent story that's going to bring humanity together on one side. But maybe what is happening is everybody is questioning the harmful and damaging parts of every story. At the same time. And it's like, this may be our culture's descent. The neat thing, if you work with stories, like the descent is not the end of myth. A descent is not even being lost in a myth. So those are really big stories that I think can work with the individual. But for the first time ever, we're working with it as stories instead of as fact. That may create the flexibility that humanity needs. Even worse, though, to me, than taking stories as facts is thinking all there is in the world is facts, is throwing out all of the stories that can even imagine a hero. I think our world has also suffered from a lack of stories.
Yeah, so we're moving into a more subjective place and individualized. I always get those confused. Or nuanced, that's the word I'm looking for, nuanced. And I think the resistance, although I happily embrace nuance and subjectivity to survive, but I can understand how it is incredibly overwhelming and almost threatening in a way. It can feel like drowning in a sea of stories. There's not one to grab onto.
Right. And especially for younger people, not one that feels clean or not corrupted.
No, every story feels, every artist, every piece of work seems corrupted. And I think that's what, yeah, I think we'd like some help with dealing with. There's nothing to help us figure out how to deal with that everything that has given us meaning seems to have a dark side. And so people have come to just assume, almost in a way, that anything they love, any person, has a darkness to them, which is probably right to assume.
And cultures have a darkness, especially your own culture. Like that's the one that people have never questioned before and never had the ability to question before. You saw, if you think about like our eyes, you saw with your culture, you could not see your culture. And now we're turning to both kind of look at it.
So is it idealistic to think that you can work on looking at the world and maybe with both a cultural eye or background and as through subjectivity as an individual? Can you have both?
Right. So here's where, like, again, balance and harmony comes in, of like trying to hold those things in tension. And as a person that grew up within stories, like kind of keeping stories, but also editing or no longer keeping the damaging part of the stories. And that being like a lifelong process.
And something that to work on, you must be selfless in a way because it's also beyond you. It's not something that will be solved in your lifetime. You're contributing to the next generation and they'll contribute to the next generation.
Yes. I've often said they're bad storytellers in the land. There's some good stories, and we need good enough stories. Like kind of, yes, it will go on after us, but it's also we're needing the story for right now.
And so
that's the story we're working on.
So no story is eternal. Every story is going to have to go through changes over time. To the point where it's unrecognizable? I don't know. Something though from a digital mind is that when I write in a Google document, all of my edits are still saved. Can look back on what the original version was, but you don't have to.
Right. We could go pretty deep there with that's the way genetics works. Like everything in the past is still there in a certain sense, but it's also kind of the way our minds work, which means like nothing is lost or wasted. But there's some stuff you wish you could forget, or there's some like, but you can. It's like part of the record. You just drew a line between like religion and art. An artist can say no story is eternal. Religion has a different sense of that. I guess religion could say no interpretation could be eternal.
Yeah. So, and I did think about religion when I said that, is that it's the only time really that a story is eternal, but then we see what happens when a story is not, it doesn't change throughout time and people are made to adhere to it. A story that has been the same since the beginning, our interpretation. Although I think that happens naturally. People's interpretation is going to be different depending on what time in history they're living in, no matter how religious they are, or even if they are religious.
Yes. We're getting into some like very dangerous water, but it's the water. What if it's the water we're in though? And it is dangerous water, of trying to sort out what is eternal and what changes through time. And I think there are many people of faith and of all faiths that some are rejecting culture altogether. That would be like fundamentalism, is to kind of reject any changes in culture. We're now in a secular age that kind of how faith can reconcile with the secular world, or what kind of relationship you have with the secular world can be. That's an important question for people of faith now.
And maybe what's eternal shouldn't be a story or isn't a story. It's a quality that pervades every story.
That sure does give a lot of breathing room and hope of like kind of working with it to like accommodate. That's what we're always doing in biology is mostly things stay the same, but other things change very slowly. And so we're always in this process of like assimilating, accommodating, adjusting without perhaps even losing like the kernel of like either truth or of what is eternal. Yes. So we'll try to like kind of get out of these waters with our skin, and but we'll jump back in them again, because this is what, as individuals and a culture, we're now facing.
Yeah.
Is what happens in that now that we're a global world. It's on the big time scale. This is a very new situation for humans.
A challenging time to be a part of, but
right. But I think the insights are coming.